Vicki Malta, and this is You and Your Mental Wellness. Tonight, I'm just going to jump right in and introduce my guest, Richard Weingarten. He's been a friend of mine and a colleague for over 20 years. Do you remember when we first met
I
each other?
remember when we first met, yeah. I just started working at CMHC in 1994.
Right.
And we met,
right.
I was starting, I think, a warm line or something, and you were interested in working on it.
Right. You had just moved to Connecticut from Ohio.
That's right, Cleveland.
And you'd been offered a job at Connecticut Mental Health Center as a director of consumer services and peer services. So why don't you just tell me a little bit about some of the things you did there and how you were able to find that job?
Interestingly, a Yale professor, John Strauss, came to Cleveland and did a presentation at a symposium on schizophrenia. And he gave a workshop after the symposium. I attended it. I thought he was really a cool guy and knew a lot about mental health, and so I went up and introduced myself, and he and I became friends and started corresponding back and forth. And then when the job opened up in New Haven, he had Karen Kangas, who was the Director of Consumer Affairs for the state, call me in Cleveland and tell me to apply for the program in New Haven. So I came to New England that spring, and I applied in New Haven. I was interviewed by 7 people in 5 hours, very intense interview.
Wow.
And I was the first person interviewed, and I had to wait 2 months to see if I got the job or not. In the meantime, I was offered 2 jobs, one in Rhode Island and one in New Hampshire, and I had to sort of keep them on the line while I was waiting for the one in New Haven, because the New Haven one was the best job.
Now, you had lived in Connecticut before?
I had.
You went to college in Connecticut, right?
I went to Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Yeah.
So you must have been really excited, when you were offered the job and.
I was, because I had a 2-year job search going, and this was the job I finally got after 2 years of looking all over the country.
And did you have a lot of ideas that you wanted to implement once you got there as a consumer?
I had some ideas, yeah. The first thing I did was start a peer support group for people with depression and anxiety disorder. We met every Thursday night at CMHC for 8 years. I was involved in that peer support group. And then I had an idea to help people when they get out of the hospital get connected to community services, because I knew from personal experience how difficult it was the first days and weeks out of the hospital. You feel very out of sync with the community, and you feel like everybody's rushing around and you're just staying in one place. So I knew that was a difficult time, and I set up a program called the Welcome Basket, which helped people when they left the hospital into the community to start to go to lunch, go to breakfast with our staff, to help them sort of get in sync with the rhythms of the community. We also started outings with that program, where we took Welcome Basket clients on outings. In the summertime, we went to the beach, or we went to the park to have a picnic. We went to amusement parks, and then we would do something on the way back, like stop in Burger King or McDonald's for lunch. And that was a very interesting program, because people really needed that kind of access to recreation and cultural activities, because people with mental illness have no discretionary income, so they can't take part in those kinds of activities. We provided access, and we provided transportation, and that became the heart and soul of our program. People said, you don't just talk about it, you go out and do it. And so it was so interesting, because the staff at the Mental Health Center saw that it was a very good program for the consumers. They started taking out their consumers on outings too, except they called it recreational therapy.
Yeah. So this was a new thing, wasn't it?
It was a new thing.
This was back in 1994.
That's
so
right.
They had never hired a peer consumer as in a director's position
No,
before.
I was the first one, yeah.
And so you had insight into how, kind of what people in recovery, people with mental illness, what they need and what they want.
Well, of course, I had my own illness that I was in recovery from, to sort of inform me as to what some of the challenges were of people with mental disabilities. In Cleveland, I worked with peer support groups and self-help groups, and so I knew that those were very helpful to people who were trying to make new friends, get involved in new activities, find some meaning and purpose in their lives. And so created the Welcome Basket. And I think we created the Warm Line for that too. The Warm Line, because I knew how lonely it was to have a mental illness and not be working and not be really circulating in the community, but staying a lot of times in your own home. So with the Warm Line, we allowed people to call an 800 number and talk to a friendly person for 10 or 15 minutes at night when things get a little bit more difficult for people.
I understand that that's one of the hardest things for people with mental illness. There's a lot of, it's very hard for them to socialize. A lot of them have been stigmatized and excluded from their families, and so they lose a lot of their confidence in themselves.
Yes, mental illness, when it strikes, is a big hit to one's self-esteem. And that takes away your confidence and your ability to socialize and to sort of like have a more or less normal life in the community. When a person has a mental illness, there's very little that they can do. I mean, they're not working, so where do they go? They maybe go to a health club like I did in Cleveland, or they go to a church like I did in Cleveland, or they go to Dunkin' Donuts and they hang out there and maybe make some conversation with people. So there's a lack of opportunity for people where to socialize, where to go and be with other people.
Right,
And that's particularly true when the illness first starts, because when you first become ill, you don't know what's going on. All you know is that you can't function the way you used to, and so you withdraw from society. You become reclusive and withdraw. That's happened to me for the first 4 or 5, 6 years of my illness.
Why don't you tell me a little bit about that, about what happened with you when you were struggling? What happened with that?
Well, I lost my confidence in social events, social affairs, so I stayed a lot alone. I've always been a big newspaper reader, having been a journalist before I became ill. So I'd spend a lot of time reading the New York Times or reading the Boston Globe, and just kind of staying by myself.
And what precipitated it?
Well, I think for me, what happened was a long-term relationship ended, and my fiance went back to Brazil, and I was without a significant other because I was with her for like 4 years while I was in Brazil. And then my significant project, I was in Latin American Affairs at the University of Texas, and I left that program. So I didn't know what I wanted to do, and without the significant project and significant other, I became ill and with depression, clinical depression. And so I went into therapy, and luckily I went into therapy with somebody really capable, a wonderful therapist who, when I was in so much in despair over my life, he gave me a lot of hope. He said that there was a way that I would recover from my illness and go on to lead a more or less normal life again.
That's really important to have people that I've talked with people over the years, and they mention that it's very important for them to have people who believe in them and who think that, and not just say, oh, you're never going to work again, or you're never going to do this or that. And so that's great that you had that, someone believe in you.
Yeah, that was very helpful. And that man, even after I left Boston, he stayed in touch with me through letters and phone calls. And he was just a wonderful therapist, somebody who wrote the book on outpatient therapy for nurses and other people that work with people with mental illness. Another thing that he did for me was he helped me solve a problem. My father wanted me to go into business with him in Ohio, and the therapist said that it would work. He thought, or he knew of families that had this kind of situation. He said that if the parents can give the keys to the son and then go to Florida and play golf, it would work. But if the parent would stay there and oversee everything the child or the son was doing, it wouldn't work. And my father was someone who had to micromanage everything, so I knew I really couldn't work in close quarters with him. So I decided to stay in Boston and make my life in other ways.
So that takes a lot of strength and courage on your part to break away from something that I think a lot of people would be really maybe hesitant to forge off in a different direction. You know, I think there must have been a lot of pressure from your family to. That's how a lot of families are. You know, pressure to conform to the way that they want you to live.
Right. There was pressure from my family, but I had already had an experience living apart from my family. I went to Brazil in the Peace Corps after college, and I was in the Peace Corps for 3 years. And there I had a very interesting and active life. And I was a director of a theater group. I wrote a column for a newspaper in Portuguese. I set up an adult literacy school for adults in the town where I was posted. I got involved in journalism because my girlfriend was a journalist. I used to go with her when she went to do stories, and I took the photographs for her stories. Then after Brazil, I was against the war in Vietnam, and I was 1A eligible for the draft. So I went to Rio, and I got a job working as a foreign news correspondent for United Press International. And I was with them for a year and a half until I turned 27, and then was out of the way of the draft and came back to the United States.
Mm-hmm. So, and then after that,
You see, I had an active life in Brazil, very
Right.
independent of my family,
Right.
where I was supporting myself and doing interesting things. So when I became ill, one of my objectives was to return to an active life
Right.
like I had before I became ill.
So you had known, because some people when they first get sick, they've never carved out a life for themselves beforehand, and you were able to see, well, this is the way I used to be, and I want to maybe not be the exact same person, but I want to have a life.
You know, therapists, after I left Boston, I moved to Los Angeles to continue my education. And I had a therapist out there that said to me one day, he said, you know, Richard, he said, it's kind of like diabetes. You know, you take your medication, you kind of live a quiet life, and you can kind of exist with the illness.
Right.
Well, that to me was very insulting because I wanted an active life. I didn't want to be dependent on my family or the government. I wanted to be able to support myself and have a kind of an interesting life again, you know? So I left that therapist. I didn't want to stay with him if that's all he thought of me. Another therapist, when I moved back to Cleveland, a therapist, I was at a bookstore working as a clerk, and one evening after the store was closed, the boss's daughter came up and said, you know, please vacuum the floor or the carpet for the store. It was a big store. I was tired. I'd worked already 10 hours that day. I said, no, I think I'll do it in the morning when I come in. She said, no, do it now. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm too tired. I'll do it in the morning. So I left. The next day, I came back to the bookstore, and she had my check in her hand and said, "You're no longer wanted. We no longer want your services." And I was fired. So I told that story to my therapist at the time. He said, Richard, he said, I think you're aiming too high. He said, you really should work at nothing higher than a dishwasher in a restaurant. And I thought, I was very angry at that, and I felt like he didn't understand me at all and didn't really believe in me either. So I left him also after a couple of weeks.
Right.
Because, I think you probably felt this way too, that you felt you had potential, that you had the ability to live a more or less normal life again, and whoever was going to treat you had to believe in you like you believed in yourself.
Right. I think, unfortunately, I don't think there are that many people who have such a strong sense, and whether they have mental illness or not, you sound like you're a real fighter and have a strong sense of yourself, and regardless of whether you had a mental illness or not, it's really amazing, even though you were diagnosed with it, that you were able to create a life for yourself that was meaningful and colorful and interesting. And I just wanted to ask you too, one of the things you told me, that when you were in depression, you said there was something that kind of helped trigger off, you're able to get back into meaningful work again, where you did a publication in Cleveland.
Yeah, that was really the start of my recovery. I worked with a self-help group that was putting together a discharge handbook for patients coming out of the Cleveland State Psychiatric Hospital. And I worked with that group for 8 months, and I felt like I was contributing again, like I was being productive. I was using my interviewing skills, I was using my writing skills, and the people of the agency treated me terrifically. They were so respectful of me. They set up a little office area for me to work at, and then twice a morning they would come by my desk and ask me if I needed anything. When they went out for lunch, they said, we'd like you to come with us if you want to. Sometimes I did, sometimes I didn't. Sometimes they brought food back for me. They just treated me so well. And during that 8 months that I worked at the agency, when I could, there was no pressure to work any kind of schedule. It was whenever I felt okay enough to work, I went in for an hour or two a day.
Mm-hmm.
And in those 8 months, feeling that I was becoming more productive again, I joined a religious congregation that was very helpful to me, made new friends and found new activities there. I was in a romantic relationship. I started to work out. I've always been a physical fitness freak, and so I was working out at a health club. And it was like I was reborn during those 8 months. I was reborn as a person who was social again. I was no longer the guy stuck in my apartment withdrawing from society. I was out doing things, interacting with people, and doing things that made a lot of sense.
Right.
So that was really the start of my recovery.
Well, it sounds like you have a lot of resilience the way
I do. I
you-
do.
and-
My first doctor said that I shouldn't take medication because in the mid-70s, medications were still very imperfect, a lot of side effects. And he said, well, you can bounce back, because I was having problems with psychotic episodes too. He said, you can bounce back from those, and you don't really need to take medication.
Mm-hmm.
And which I did.
Great. So just going back to eventually taking on the job in Connecticut as the director of consumer peer services at Connecticut Mental Health Center and Bridgeport Mental Health Center through the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. So it sounds like you created a lot of different programs and things
I
like
did.
that.
My objective was to create jobs for consumers because I knew that the right kind of job makes a lot of sense for people in recovery. Every time I created a job for somebody, they shot forward in recovery. They found something purposeful to do. They got a little income for it. They felt much better about themselves. I'll give you an example. One person that I worked with said before she started working for me, she wouldn't go to any family gatherings. She said family functions, she said when people ask her, what are you up to these days? What are you doing with your life? She didn't have an answer for them, so she stayed away. But once she got a job working as a warm line operator, she went to the family functions, was able to talk about her work, talk about her life, made a big difference in her life. And that's why I really dedicated myself to creating jobs for people, new services for consumers.
That's great. Now you did that for 15 years, 10 years
Yeah.
in New Haven and 5 years in Bridgeport.
Right.
And you told me that you came across some friction with some of the, because you said at the time at those mental health centers they were very clinical and focused on the medical. Well, why don't you tell me about that a little
Well,
bit?
they'd never seen peers working before, and so they thought the peers weren't able to work, that they weren't together enough to hold down a job, or they would do something crazy and hurt the person they were working with. So there's a lot of I would say skepticism about the peer-run programs. There was, for example, in Bridgeport we started a program called the WRAP program, which is Wellness Recovery Action Plan, as you know, and it's a six-class program where people learn how to manage their symptoms, promote their recovery, promote their well-being. And when we first started out, the staff there didn't believe in it. They didn't refer anybody to it because they thought, what can consumers teach another consumer? The program was actually developed by a consumer. So a lot of skepticism, a lot of opposition. But after a few years, I've been told by the people that are there now, the staff actually go up to them and say, look, I've got a person who would really benefit by the WRAP program. How can I get that person in the program?
Right.
So it's been a complete turnaround. The same thing happened at Yale New Haven Hospital where we were working in the emergency room. The hospital was very skeptical about us working there with their staff. They thought that we would screw up, that we would do crazy things, that we would get in the way of the staff. So they had a lot of opposition. But after 2 months of us working in the peer support ER, they were on board. They thought it was the greatest program going.
So you're like a pioneer.
I
You
always
were
thought
one
of
of the
myself
first.
as kind of
You were one
as
of the
kind
first
a pathbreaker,
people.
yeah.
You were one of the first people to break down stigma, and now you said that Connecticut is has one of the best mental health systems
in the
country, maybe the world, too.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but Connecticut has done some really good things for the mental health system. They transformed the system from more of a medical model to a recovery model back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Why don't you talk about that a little bit? What the difference? Well, you did
Okay.
mention that.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, because you did mention a little bit about what the medical model is. Maybe if you could just say a little
Yeah,
more.
the medical model, is more of a psychiatric model that looks at a person's illness and symptoms and tries to alleviate the symptoms. It also looks at the person's problems and deficits and tries to find ways of overcoming the problems and the deficits. A lot of it is based on biological medicine, which holds that medications really are the thing to control symptoms with. The recovery model is a model where the person in the treatment is more in charge of their treatment. I like to say that the person is in the driver's seat. So what that person wants to do is really then assisted by the mental health professionals that are treating them. It's not that they overlook symptoms, because symptoms are a part of it, and you have to learn how to cope with symptoms and manage symptoms. That's for sure. But a consumer just doesn't want to be a symptom manager. A person wants a life. They want to do things that make sense, that things that they want to do that they haven't had a chance to do. They want to go back to school, they want to get a job, want to start a family. And in the recovery model, which instead of patient treatment, it's person-centered planning, where the person himself talks about those areas of his life that he wants to achieve, and the mental health system is there to help him achieve that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a big change.
Right, right. So it sounds like you were giving back to other people what few people that believed in you gave back to people.
I based a lot of my work on my own recovery because I know what worked for me, and I thought it would work for other people too.
Mm-hmm. Now, we don't have too much time left. There are a couple other things I wanted to talk to you about. You've traveled extensively around the United States, and you, like you said, you were in Brazil with the Peace Corps.
Mm-hmm.
What are the systems, mental health systems like down there, and what was your experience with that, and as well as when you were in Israel and the Netherlands?
Right. Well, Brazil is interesting because it's the first Latin American country that has a social movement to downsize and close the long-term psychiatric hospitals and open up community services. And so one of the things I did in Brazil was I joined the social movement to do that. And I went around and I talked about the community services that I was involved in Connecticut. And they were interested in that. I talked about peer support groups. They are interested in that. I brought out a book in Portuguese that was a collection of 17 recovery stories of Brazilians who told their recovery stories to me, and then we made a book out of it.
Mm-hmm.
The Brazilians, because the social movement was national and was reforming the mental health system there, they were interested in our consumer movement in this country. And so I wrote a history of the consumer movement in the United States and published it in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
I was back in Brazil for 5 weeks back in June and July of this year, and May and June. And I gave a number of talks in cities about my recovery, because recovery is just starting out there.
Mm-hmm.
So I talked about my recovery, and I talked about a little bit about some of the services and programs that I've been involved with. It was a very interesting experience for me. I made a lot of friends, and I got to some parts of Brazil that I hadn't been to before, like the far south, which is near Argentina and Uruguay. It's Pampas area, a lot of cattle raising. So people down there are like Texans, you know, they're very macho and very different than the people that I worked with in Rio or in northeastern Brazil.
Right, right. That's really interesting. So
in terms of international work, the Netherlands and Italy and the Scandinavian countries and parts of England are very interested in our recovery model because they're a little bit behind us. So I was able to host some of the delegations from the Netherlands in New York, where I took them to peer-run services and programs and talked to them about recovery and peer support. And then they went back to the Netherlands and started some of the same programs for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Like the RAP program. I introduced the RAP program in the Netherlands. Well, I introduced it in New York. Then people went back there and started offering it to their clients.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's great. So you've really made an impact in different parts of the world. And the final thing that I wanted to ask you about was you said for today you were involved. You're retired. You've been retired for 5 years from Demas, and you're very involved with the Unitarian Society now.
Yes.
And it sounds like all along your life you've had this calling or this drive to do something to change, you know.
I'm a person of the 60s. I always thought that one of my missions in life was to be a change agent. So I've seen myself as somebody who helps with the social change in this country. In the Unitarians are like other congregations where there are people with mental illness in the congregation, but they're kind of excluded. They're not really integrated into the congregation because of stigma, because of the pain they've suffered being rejected or excluded by other groups. So what we're doing there is we're trying to start a monthly social hour where we'll have people socialize and have some food to drink or food to eat, and we'll have like a little peer support group and some spirituality, and we'll give people a chance to really feel good at the church, so that they'll feel like participate in other areas of the church life.
Right.
And I see that religious congregations as having a huge role to play in terms of integrating people back into their congregations, but also be a stepping stone back into the community. Not only the people with mental illness, but their families too, because the families also suffer from stigma and oftentimes are excluded and don't participate. So people in those religious congregations have to be proactive in terms of helping people integrate into the congregations. You just can't expect it to happen automatically.
So you would say that your main focus right now in your life is to be involved with the Unitarian Society, and to it's like the next chapter in your life that you want to focus on and work on that, which is. And you told me also that you're going to be doing a sermon at one of
I'm going to be doing a sermon in August at the First Congregational Church of Granby, and it's part of their hospitality series. And so what I'm going to will be doing there is I'm going to tell my recovery story, but I'm also going to lay out a kind of a plan for helping them welcome and integrate people with mental disabilities into their mix.
Well, it sounds like you're doing a lot of great things, Richard. You know,
I try to stay busy, you
I've
know,
known you
because with retirement, you just can't do nothing.
Right.
You've got to focus. You've got to structure your time in some meaningful way.
right. Well, you're still working at it. You're still striving, and I think that's what it's all about. And you know, I think what we're gonna have to close in a minute. But I just wanted to thank you very much for being on, and
My pleasure.
you know, I really I learn something new from you every time I talk to you, and that you have a lot of really good qualities in wanting to change the world, you know, change the world, change society's ideas about one of the most stigmatizing illnesses there is, and
Mental illness is still the last taboo. It's still the thing people don't like to talk about.
right,
Remember back when we were growing up, they used the C word for cancer. Wouldn't say the word.
right,
It's the same thing with mental illness now. People don't want to talk about it. There's a lot of misinformation about it, and people are very uncomfortable. And one of my missions is to help people learn how to be a friend or be a support to people with mental illness and their families.
right.
It's not impossible. It's not rocket science. It's just being able to treat the person like a normal person, really.
Thank you so much for being on the show, and
Thank you,
I
Vicki.
think you're going to help a lot of people out there who are watching, give them hope, and I want to thank you very much. Like I said, that you're to be a guest on my show, and just want to thank Josh Kelly, Abigail White. I want to thank Antoinette Jalbert, and I want to thank all the people who've been involved with putting together this show. So we'll see you next month, and thank you very much for tuning in, and see you in August.